self-protective fear? How much did you have to give yourself permission to leave certain things in?
Like, definitely wanted vignettes and stories that served the theme. So I would take out like a paragraph that started to be too tangential, or a section. There was a lot of touring stuff that I took out because it starts to feel like it's mirroring tour itself, which is just this kind of like redundant.
Also on tour for like an entire decade.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't want it to feel like it's, I'm describing tour as monotonous in the book. You don't want the book itself to start feeling monotonous, or like a diary. So a lot of it was anything that felt redundant, basically. In terms of the personal stuff, I, again, would just kind of, I never even started down certain paths that I didn't think fit into the story. And then I had my editor, and then a friend of mine who's a creative writing professor. She was one of my main readers, and she would, give me notes, and I would go back and clarify things. But a lot of it was, that came later, the editing. For the real editing, I thought, came later.
So something that struck me about this book that I've also seen people tweet about is that it's like a total cry-laugh book. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, since you really do talk about being, this sort of like the real eager natural performer in you, but you're also a feminist, like what is more powerful to you? What's perhaps the more potent compliment, even, like that you've cracked somebody up or someone can identify with your story?
I feel like I don't have to choose. They both feel really good. I mean, it just, I feel like they coexist well in the book in a way that I'm really happy with. And I don't think there's much of a difference sometimes between, sad and happy. I mean, in a sense, you're still this almost, they mirror each other a little bit. And I was really intentional about having there be levity to balance out some of the darker places in the book. So that they both feel like a compliment to me.
When you were working on this, did you think about, when I read this book, I think this is more a book for all the people that know you from music. And maybe it's also kind of an introduction, like, hello, perhaps you have seen me on the TV, this is the other thing I do. Like, was there any thought of who was reading it beyond, did you have, I don't say like an ideal reader, but I know sometimes when I'm working on something, I have like one friend in mind where I'm like, this will make sense to them. And I sort of, it's easier for me to write if I'm directing it. I know perhaps there's like a fantasized audience in some ways. Did that happen for you though?
Not really. I mean, I always think, like, Zadie Smith has this great thing about writing where she's talking about, that books are, like, the way we think about books now, like, they're supposed to entertain and the reader's supposed to feel entertained. And then she's like, but what about thinking about it like the author has given you a sheet of music, and as a reader, you're sitting at the piano and you're trying to sort of figure out what they mean and what their intention is, and you're kind of working with the text. And I think that's such a more sophisticated way of thinking about who the reader is, and not assuming that just because they might know me from Portlandia that they're not going to see the parts of this book that are actually very much the seeds for Portlandia. I mean, if you read this book and read about indie rock and these communities, any kind of community, it doesn't have to be couched in music, that really, professes inclusion, but actually feels very elitist or exclusive. I talk a lot about those experiences in the book, and that is so much of what we talk about on Portlandia. And so, I really was trying to trust in the reader that that this wasn't just a book for fans of the band.
A lot of the book is also about the way that being a fan transformed you. Can you talk about why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for one, when I was young, being a fan allowed me to feel seen at a time when I felt very small. I did not feel seen by the family that I was growing up in, and fandom allowed me to posit myself in a situation where I felt seen because of the love that I was projecting out. Like, you know, it's so much more about having a conduit, you know, through which to love than actually to be loved. So so expressing that love and feeling like it was already giving me something in return, which was that it was making me feel alive, and it allowed me to have certain feelings, and just allowed me to kind of process the confusion of my life. Like, I felt a stability, I think, that I hadn't really felt. Also, there's a sense of later of just community, so that you coalesce with other, basically lovers, you know, lovers of this entity, you know, whether it's, in this case, music. And through that, you know, you feel a shared wonder. And I think that's a really beautiful feeling. It's kind of like, you know, being held. And so I think through that, it then, you know, at some point, I also wanted to be a participant in terms of actually playing, but for a while, and still, I think fandom is something that I hold in a very sacred place, because it always feels like an incessant curiosity and a desire to understand, a desire to connect either with the piece itself or with the other people that are experiencing the same sense of affection.
I think I hope sometimes that we're in a cultural moment of sort of where we're legitimizing being a fangirl in a lot of ways, because I think, you know, for so long we've grown up understanding that sort of women are just attracted to like the shiny surfaces of music or of the pop stars that they adore. And I think this book actually goes a really long way to showing, like, you know, the ways that being a fangirl is very legitimate, like that it's just absolutely being loved and transformed by music. Was that something that was in your mind at all? Maybe I'm projecting my own feminist agenda.
No, I mean, well, I felt like that the narrative would speak to that, like would speak to a certain legitimizing, in the sense that it was the thing that, you know, helped me transition, that it wasn't a passive experience, that it wasn't a temporary state, that it had transformative power, and that it was, there was nothing, you know, sort of cute or, you know, paltry about it, like that it's part of creation, like it's part of, and creativity, I think, like, in terms of how you relate to something. But yeah, I mean, so I thought about it in that way, but not in the same way of like, well, I hope this legitimizes fandom for, but, you know, I wanted to talk about how it had done that for me.
I think when I was reading your book, I kept thinking about that this band seems like a way that you got free, a way for you to be free, and that making music and performing and trying on just the identities of who you can become when you're playing this song, when you're singing this song, when you're on stage with other women. I mean, what is that how it felt, I guess? I mean, that's sort of what I don't know, maybe get free is a strange word for that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it was a way of, yeah, I keep referring to this quote by this essayist Charles D'Ambrosio that he talks about in his essays Loitering, and that, you know, writing for him is the dream of making the distance go away. And I think that Sleater-Kinney was very much that liminal space for me that involved fantasy and involved partnership, collaboration, you know, pushing ourselves creatively. It involved, you know, just risk-taking, and certainly a sense of emotionality that I had not been able to access before. And so I think a lot of the stories in there do speak to how the band was about trying to make that distance, that I felt that detachment in my younger self go away. And of course, as I get to later in the book, at a certain point, I had to come to terms with the fact that it could not solely function in that way. But certainly it did for a long time, and still does to a certain extent, except that I think that when we returned to it this past year, we all had a better sense of ourselves.